Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'll be showing you guys how to calculate financial ratios using the information directly from the SEC. The final output would be a table similar to the one you're looking at right now. These are the financial ratios we will be calculating in the script. So apart from the symbol, the date we ran this, the market price, we will be getting the debt to market cap, our PEG ratio, our price to book, price to sales, profit margin, return on equity, price to earnings, our trailing 12 months of EPS, our market cap, some balance sheet info such as assets, liabilities, stockholders' equity, shares outstanding, the latest trailing 12 months of revenue, sales per share, book value per share, and our average EPS growth. Now let's close this out and go to our main script. Alright, so a couple of weeks ago I went over the script on how to use the SEC API to pull all financial information for any company that you search for. And at the end of this video, I'll go ahead and recommend that tutorial so that you know how to use this API. So in that tutorial, I showed you how to assign your user agent. We read in a table which contains the company tickers and their CIK codes. We format those CIK codes and return it as a data frame. And we have a helper function that retrieves the CIK number in order for us to get the filings for that specific ticker. The only major change I made to that script is in this get all Edgar function, which if we open this up and we scroll towards the bottom, you will need to add this block, and this is for a different accounting method for companies not in the US that don't follow GAAP. So IFRS is the international version of GAAP essentially. So you will need to add this block right after our GAAP block. So if you place it right underneath, we use IFRS-full, and this is going to be assigned to IFRS. When we combine all our data, you need to place IFRS in this line as well. So that's the only change I made to that script in case you want to get data for companies not following GAAP. So let's go ahead and minimize this function. I'm going to go ahead and run these blocks and functions. Now in the next part, I just assign a couple of tickers that I want to get data for, so just ignore this block here. But the main function I want to go over is called get ratios. This is the function that will be returning the table I showed you at the beginning of the video. I also have a helper function. On some instances, very rare, but some instances such as Berkshire Hathaway, even though they have specified the number of shares outstanding, for some reason when I request the data, it's not found in those filings. It may be due to the fact that they have the same tag for class A shares and class B shares. I'm not sure if that's the case for all companies, but for that specific one, I ran into some issues. So I created this helper function, which gets the number of shares outstanding via bar chart. So if we open up this function, the first thing we do in this function is we create a URL. This URL will take us to the quote page where we can find the number of shares outstanding. We then read HTML and I pass in the XPath where we can find that information. I do some formatting and return that as numeric. Let's run this function. All right, let's open up our get ratios function. So we start off by passing in a ticker and read in all the financial data available from the SEC via their API. I then get the latest quote for that ticker and assign the close to market price. So let's run through an example line by line. I have assigned Amazon as our ticker. So let's go ahead and pull information from the SEC. And if we take a look at DF, these are all of our financial values available for Amazon, which includes the start date, the end date, and I believe if there's no start date, then this is information from the balance sheet, the value assigned to the description. So for accounts payable, this was the value, ending 12/31/2008, the access number to the filing, the fiscal year, the quarter, what form this was on, the date it was filed, the frame. Sometimes they add this, sometimes they leave it out. It's not consistent, so I rarely use it. But as you can see, this is for the current year, 2008, quarter 4. So we will be using this table to calculate our ratios. Now let's close this out and continue on with the script. So then I get the latest quote to get the market price. Now for some of these companies, you need to access their actual filings online to make sure that they're using these tags. But for the majority of these, I found that the revenue or the top line is assigned to these two tags for the most part. So all I'm doing in this line is subsetting our main data frame to only those two tags. And then I order these by file date. So if we take a look at Rev 1, here we have 22 entries. So it looks like Amazon is using the long tag for its sales or revenue. And as you can see, these are ordered by file date. So now we're going to use this table to get the trailing 12 months of revenue. A common pattern I saw using this API was that these seem to be cumulative. So we can't just add the last 4 values to get the cumulative trailing 12 months. Since you can tell that for 2021, they all have the same start date, What we have to do is subtract the cumulative value from the previous one to get the quarterly revenue and do the same for all of 2021. So let's continue on with our script. Since this is ordered by filing date, the last row will be our latest filing. I'm going to extract the latest filing number and then retrieve the latest revenue. Now in this following block is where we convert all revenue into quarterly revenue, and we start off by passing in the start dates. Now to extract the last 4 quarters of revenue, I'm going to use lapply and pass our start dates as a list into this function, which will do the calculations and return the table, and then I'm just going to row bind our results. So let's open up this function. So we subset our revenue table by the start date we pass in, and then I reorder by end date. Now if more than one row is returned, then I will do the following, which is that for each row, I subtract the previous revenue from our latest, and that will give us our quarterly revenue. Since this is going to be calculating the differences in revenue, I need to add back the revenue for the first quarter. So in these 3 lines, I extract the revenue for the first quarter, I assign that as a data frame, and then I row bind all of our data together. So if temp is only one row, it means that it's the latest quarter, or the very first quarter in the fiscal year. So we don't need to find any differences in revenue. We can just return that row as it is. So let's go ahead and minimize this and run it. And then we're going to go ahead and order by date. And if we take a look at that table, we will now be able to see quarterly revenue. And all we need to do now is just sum the last 4 observations or the 4 values to get the trailing 12 months of revenue. So let's go ahead and assign that. So again, just sum the last 4 observations. Now we move on to our next block, which is extracting the cost of revenue or cost of goods sold. Again, you need to look out for the tags, but for the majority, I found the tags to be cost of revenue, cost and expenses, or cost of goods and services sold. So again, we're just subsetting our main data frame to only those tags. We then order this table by end date and then extract the latest value. Now we can calculate our profit margin by subtracting the latest cost of revenue from our latest revenue and dividing that by our latest revenue. So let's go ahead and run that line. Now let's move on to the shares outstanding. So for the shares outstanding, I found a couple of tags. So again, we're subsetting our main data frame to only these tags. I'm going to retrieve the latest value and return that as numeric. Now, if for some reason the filing doesn't include the number of shares outstanding, we're going to use our helper function to retrieve this value from bar charts. Luckily, this is not the case for Amazon, but once we have the number of shares outstanding, we can calculate our sales per share and price to sales. So I'm dividing the latest trailing 12 months of revenue by the number of shares outstanding to get the sales per share, and then I'm going to pass that in and divide the market price by the sales per share to get the price to sales ratio. Alright, so now I'm going to run this section and continue on with the script. The next step is to calculate the book value. So luckily, since we have balance sheet data, we need to find our tags from our main data frame that include assets and liabilities. And again, we're going to retrieve the value for our latest filing and return that as numeric. Sometimes what companies do in these filings that I've noticed is that they don't include the liabilities. What companies do instead is that they provide the stockholders' equity. So if that's the case, then we need to subset our main data frame and look for these tags for stockholders' equity and retrieve the latest value. And then we can just use the accounting formula to extract the liabilities by subtracting stockholders' equity from assets. But that's only if the sum of the liabilities is equal to 0. Otherwise, the company does provide the liabilities, and we can use our accounting formula to extract the stockholders' equity by subtracting the liabilities from assets. So now that we have our stockholders' equity, we can calculate our book value per share, which is just dividing our stockholders' equity by the number of shares outstanding. And then we're going to pass that value in and divide the market price by the book value per share to get the price to book ratio. So let's go ahead and run this section. Alright, for the next section, we are calculating earnings per share. So here I'm looking for the diluted EPS or the basic EPS. So we're looking for these tags in our main data frame. Let's go ahead and run that. We extract the unique start dates from our EPS table. Let's take a look at our EPS table and scroll all the way to the bottom. So similar to our revenue table, we need to subtract the cumulative sum from the previous quarter since these are grouped by fiscal year. So we will apply a similar code to the one we did with revenue to get the quarterly EPS for each of these filings. And then we can calculate the trailing 12 months of EPS. So I'll go ahead and close this. Now, in very rare occasions, these filings will include the EPS, but these filings are very old. So here I'm testing whether or not the last observation of start dates is less than 200 days. If that's the case, we can't use our EPS because this data is very old. And what we're going to do to fix that is we need to subset our net income. And by doing so, we need to also extract our number of shares outstanding. And we're going to calculate our EPS manually. But that's in rare occasions. And hopefully this API gets updated to include these tags for EPS. So again, if our EPS data is very old, we're going to go ahead and calculate earnings per share manually by dividing net income by the number of shares outstanding. And then what I do is I get the last 10 observations. We don't need to calculate this for all the quarters. Pass in our start dates, subset our net income for that specific start date. I reorder by end date, which will make the last observation the latest. And similar to revenue, if the number of rows is greater than 1, then I'm going to find the differences in net income and shares outstanding. If the number of rows is only 1, then I just return that value. So all we're doing in this section is matching up our net incomes with our number of shares outstanding to make sure that we divide the right quarters. But all this section is very similar to our revenue section, in which we will just be returning our quarterly EPS. When we pass in our start dates, if it's only 1 row, it means that it's the latest filing, so it will only include 1 quarter. So again, after matching up our net incomes with our number of shares outstanding, we're going to go ahead and divide our net income by the number of shares outstanding to get our EPS, and then just return that as a data frame. But this is only for the instances where we don't have EPS data, but we do have net income, and we can use our number of shares outstanding to calculate our EPS. So let's go ahead and minimize this. Otherwise, we can just use our EPS data to calculate the trailing 12 months of EPS. And again, we pass in our start dates. So let's open this up. Again, very similar to our revenue section, where we subset our table by the start date. We then reorder, and if the number of rows in temp is greater than 1, we need to find the differences. We then add back the first quarter and return that as a data frame. If there's only 1 row, then we just return that value essentially. All right, so let's go ahead and minimize this. So after we calculate our quarterly EPS, we can order by date and then just sum the last 4 observations to get our trailing 12 months. So let's go ahead and run this block. Alright, so now that we have our latest trailing 12 months of EPS, we can calculate our PE ratio, which is just the market price divided by the latest trailing 12 months of EPS. So let's go ahead and run that. Alright, so to calculate our PEG ratio, what I did was to find the average growth rate in the latest 5 observations of our trailing 12 months of EPS data. So that's how I found the growth rate, to give me a better understanding of how our EPS is growing over the last 5 quarters. You can increase the value if you want to find the growth rate for a longer period of time. But once we assign that, we can calculate our PEG ratio by just dividing our price to earnings ratio by the average growth rate times 100, since this gets returned as a percentage. So we run that line to find our PEG ratio. Now we can also calculate our market cap by multiplying our number of shares outstanding by the market price. And we can also find our debt to market cap ratio by dividing liabilities over market cap. All right, the next thing we're going to calculate is the return on equity. So what I'm going to do is subset our net income or loss using our main data frame, getting the last observation and returning that as numeric. Once we have our net income or loss, we can divide that by our stockholders' equity to get our return on equity. And once we have calculated everything, we can then just group everything together and return that as a data frame. So that's what this line will be doing. Once we do that, I'm going to reformat the column names for the very first 2 columns, which is the symbol and date, and also the columns for sales per share, book value per share, and average EPS growth. And after we have that, we can just return that data frame, which if we take a look at fund data, it looks like the table we saw at the beginning of the video. Now, one thing I wanted to also mention is that for tickers such as Amazon, since this recently underwent a split, some of the financial information might not be available, but an easy fix would just be to adjust the market price by the split ratio. I think that would be easier than adjusting all the ratios by the split factor. And I haven't used this API long enough to know if the values get updated or revised after splits, but that's just something extra and rare that we need to consider as well. So now that we have this working, we can go ahead and close this out and minimize our function and run it. So we're going to go ahead and minimize get ratios. We're going to go ahead and run this function, and we're going to get the ratios for Microsoft. Now if we take a look at the table, we have 20 columns, and it appears that all the data is there. So now that we have this function working, we can go ahead and call multiple tickers and pass that into this lapply, where we pass in our tickers as a list and apply this function. Now this is wrapped in a try function, just in case there's any errors. It will keep running and it will not crash. So let's go ahead and get ratios for these two tickers. After that gets completed, we can row bind all the results, and we're going to assign that into all. So we take a look at that table. So depending on the length of the tickers that you have, you will see a different row and all the financial ratios for hopefully all the tickers you assigned. Well guys, hopefully this was useful. You can always add your own ratios into that function that I didn't mention here, but hopefully the script gets you in the right direction. But this concludes the video, guys. I will leave a link down in the description area for the Patreon where you can find the script. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.